The hum of the refrigerator was my constant companion in those quiet, pre-dawn hours. It was a low, mournful sound, the kind that filled the space left by a life that had grown steadily smaller. My wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 3 years, and the silence she left behind was a physical presence. It was in her empty armchair, in the unhummed tunes that used to fill the kitchen, and in the second coffee cup that remained, forever clean, on the shelf. I was 72, a retired accountant who now spent his days counting not numbers, but pills. There was one for blood pressure, another for cholesterol, a little white one for the arthritis in my knuckles, and a baby aspirin, just for good measure. My doctor, a well-meaning young woman who always spoke to me in slightly too loud, cheerful tones, said I was in reasonably good health for my age. I hated that phrase. It felt like a consolation prize for a race I was slowly but surely losing. My grandson Leo, a whirlwind of teenage energy and baffling slang, was the one who inadvertently started it all. He had come over for his weekly duty visit, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his phone. "Gramps," he'd said, not looking up, "you should do a challenge, like on TikTok." I had only a vague understanding of what TikTok was, imagining it to be a repository of dancing teenagers and cat videos. I grunted in response, my attention on the sports section of the newspaper. "No, for real," he insisted, finally looking up. "They have these health challenges. Like this one guy, he ate only fruit for a week, and this other lady, she drank a gallon of water a day." He showed me a video of a man with alarmingly white teeth holding a massive watermelon. The title flashed across the screen. "I ate watermelon every day for 30 days. The results will shock you." I scoffed. "Nonsense, clickbait." "Maybe," Leo shrugged, his attention already returning to his phone. "But what if it's not?" That question, as innocuous as it was, planted a seed. What if? It was a phrase I hadn't entertained in years. My life was a predictable landscape of routine and medication. There were no what ifs. There was only what is. And what is was a slow, steady decline. But that night, as I lay in bed, the silence of the house pressing in on me, the thought of that bright red watermelon returned. It was a memory from a different time, a hotter time. Summer picnics with Eleanor, the sticky sweet juice dripping down our chins as we laughed. The vibrant, impossible red of it felt like a splash of life in my monochromatic world. I am not an impulsive man. My entire career was built on careful calculation and risk assessment. But the next morning, something shifted. As I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, the thinning gray hair, the deep-etched lines of worry and grief, a strange resolution took hold. I was going to do it. I was going to eat watermelon every day for 30 days. It felt absurd, a foolish act of rebellion against the sensible, beige world I had constructed for myself. And that, I realized, was precisely why I had to do it. What happens next will change the way you see everything. Day one began with a trip to the supermarket, a place I usually navigated with the joyless efficiency of a military operation. But today was different. I bypassed the sensible apples and bananas and made my way to the towering green pyramids of watermelons. I felt a pang of uncertainty. How does one choose a good watermelon? I remembered my father thumping them, his ear pressed close as if listening for a secret. I mimicked his actions, feeling slightly foolish as I tapped on the hard, green rinds. A young woman with a baby in her cart smiled at me. "Looking for a sweet one?" she asked. I admitted my ignorance, and she shared her own method. "Look for the one with a creamy yellow spot on the bottom, the field spot, where it had rested in the sun. The heavier it feels for its size, the juicier it will be." I left with a watermelon that felt as heavy as a cannonball and a strange sense of accomplishment. Back in my kitchen, I felt a tremor of what I could only describe as excitement. The simple act of slicing into that great green orb felt significant. The knife went in with a satisfying crunch, and the sweet, fresh scent filled the air. The deep, vibrant red of the flesh was even more brilliant than I had remembered. It looked like life itself. I cut a thick crescent moon slice and took a bite. The rush of cool, sweet juice was a shock to my system. It was pure, unadulterated summer. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just eating, I was experiencing. The first few days were a novelty. I ate watermelon with my breakfast, as a midday snack, and as a dessert after dinner. I tried it cubed, balled, and in thick, messy wedges. The initial effect was, shall we say, pronounced. Watermelon, as I quickly discovered, is mostly water. My trips to the bathroom became noticeably more frequent. It was a bit of an inconvenience, but it also made me realize something startling. I was probably chronically dehydrated. Like many people my age, I drank coffee in the morning and maybe a glass of water with my pills, but I rarely felt thirsty. The constant intake of watermelon was forcing hydration upon me. Within that first week, a persistent, dull headache that I had accepted as a normal part of my existence simply vanished. I felt clearer. But by day 5, the novelty began to wear off, replaced by a subtle, creeping dread. The truth will shock you by minute 3. It was the sugar. While the natural sugars in fruit are generally considered healthier than refined sugars, my body, accustomed to a fairly bland diet, was reacting. I felt a strange, jittery energy in the afternoons, followed by a sudden, crashing fatigue. I started to worry about my blood sugar. As a man in my 70s with a family history of diabetes, this was no small concern. The what if that had felt so liberating a few days ago now felt ominous. What if I was doing more harm than good? My doctor's cheerful, condescending voice echoed in my head. Now, Harold, we don't want to be making any drastic dietary changes without consulting a professional. I could picture her disappointed frown. The watermelon in my refrigerator, once a symbol of vibrant rebellion, now seemed to mock me with its sugary siren song. I was on the verge of quitting, of retreating back to the safety of my beige, sensible world. That night, sleep offered no escape. I dreamt of drowning in a sea of pink juice, the sweet stickiness of it filling my lungs. But then, something unexpected happened. On the morning of day 7, I woke up before my alarm. Not just awake, but alert. The usual grogginess that clung to me like a damp coat was gone. I walked to the kitchen, and on a whim, I didn't reach for the coffee maker. Instead, I opened the refrigerator and cut a slice of watermelon. The cool sweetness of it was refreshing, not jarring. And as I sat at my kitchen table, the early morning sun slanting through the window, I felt a quiet sense of well-being. The jitteriness of the previous days was gone. It was as if my body had finally adjusted, had found a new equilibrium. It was this small but significant victory that propelled me forward. I started to do more research, not on TikTok this time, but on reliable medical websites and nutrition journals. I learned that watermelon is rich in an amino acid called citrulline, which the body converts to arginine, another amino acid that helps improve blood flow. Could this be contributing to my newfound clarity of mind? Was it the reason the nagging ache in my arthritic knuckles seemed to have subsided? Just a little. I read about lycopene, the powerful antioxidant that gives watermelon its red color, and its potential benefits for heart health and in protecting against certain types of cancer. The more I read, the more I realized that this silly challenge might have some real science behind it. Armed with this new knowledge, I approached the second week with a revised strategy. Portion control was key. I wasn't just blindly eating as much watermelon as I could, I was being mindful of it. I started incorporating it into my meals in more creative ways. I made a salad with watermelon, feta cheese, and mint. The combination of sweet, salty, and savory was a revelation to my taste buds. I even tried grilling it, a suggestion I found on a cooking blog that sounded utterly bizarre but turned out to be delicious. The heat caramelized the sugars, giving it a rich, smoky flavor. My culinary world, once limited to a rotation of 5 or 6 bland and easy-to-prepare meals, was suddenly expanding. The physical changes continued to be subtle, yet undeniable. I had always been an avid walker, my daily constitutional and non-negotiable part of my routine. But in recent years, my walks had become shorter, my pace slower. My knees would ache, and I'd be out of breath by the time I reached the top of the small hill at the end of my street. Around day 12, I noticed that the hill seemed a little less daunting. I wasn't gasping for air at the summit. In fact, I felt good enough to keep going. I walked an extra block that day, and then 2 the next. I felt a surge of energy that was clean and sustained, not the jittery artificial buzz of too much caffeine or sugar. It was as if my body was finally getting the fuel it had been craving. Of course, it wasn't all a rosy picture. There were days when the thought of another piece of watermelon was enough to make my stomach turn. I missed the simple pleasure of a crunchy apple or a handful of grapes. I had to be careful when I went out, planning my meals to ensure I could incorporate my daily portion of watermelon. One afternoon, I met a friend for lunch at a diner. I discreetly pulled out a small container of cubed watermelon to have with my sandwich. He raised an eyebrow. "On a new health kick, Harold?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. I felt a flash of self-consciousness, but it quickly faded. I explained my 30-day experiment, and to my surprise, he was intrigued. We ended up having a long conversation about health and aging, about the small things we can do to feel a little bit better. It was the most meaningful conversation I had with him in years. The third week was when things got really interesting. The changes were no longer just physical, they were mental. My mood, which had been hovering in a persistent state of low-grade melancholy since Eleanor's passing, began to lift. I found myself humming in the mornings, a habit I thought had died with my wife. I started noticing small details on my walks, the intricate pattern of a spider's web, the vibrant purple of the wildflowers growing in a neighbor's yard. It was as if a layer of gray film had been peeled away from my perception of the world. Was it the hydration, the vitamins, or was it simply the act of doing something for myself, of taking control of one small aspect of my life? Maybe it was all of the above. I even had an encounter that felt like something out of a movie. On day 21, I was in the produce aisle, thumping watermelons like a seasoned pro, when a woman about my age asked me for advice on how to pick a good one. I shared the tip about the creamy yellow field spot. We started talking, and it turned out she was new to the neighborhood. Her name was Margaret, and she had a quick wit and a warm, genuine smile. We talked for 20 minutes, right there next to the melons. I hadn't had a conversation like that with a new person in years. As we parted ways, she said, "Well, Harold, you've convinced me. I'm going to try your watermelon trick." I went home with a good watermelon and an even better feeling. The final week of the challenge felt like the home stretch of a marathon. I was in a groove now. The routine of cutting up the watermelon each morning was no longer a chore, but a comforting ritual. I had more energy, my joints ached less, and my mood was consistently brighter. I had even lost a few pounds, a pleasant side effect of substituting high-calorie snacks with a low-calorie, high-volume fruit. But the most profound change was one I hadn't expected. On day 29, Leo came for his weekly visit. I had a big bowl of watermelon salad waiting for him. He eyed it suspiciously at first, but then took a bite. "Whoa, Gramps, this is actually good," he said, his mouth full. We sat and talked, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a duty visit. I told him all about my experiment, the good, the bad, and the surprising. He listened, genuinely interested. He even put his phone down. "You know, Gramps," he said when I had finished, "you seem different." "Different how?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "Happier," he said. "You're just happier." And he was right. I was happier. The watermelon hadn't cured my arthritis or reversed the aging process. It hadn't brought my wife back, but it had done something just as miraculous. It had woken me up. It had reminded me that my life was not over, that there was still room for what-ifs, for new experiences, for joy. It had shown me that even small changes can have a profound impact, and that taking care of my body was an act of self-love, not just a medical necessity. On day 30, I ate my last obligatory slice of watermelon. There was no grand finale, no fireworks. It was just a quiet moment of reflection in my sunny kitchen. The experiment was over, but its effects lingered. I knew I wouldn't eat watermelon every single day for the rest of my life, but I also knew I would never look at it the same way again. It was no longer just a fruit. It was a symbol of my rebellion, a catalyst for change. The next morning, for the first time in 31 days, I didn't eat watermelon for breakfast. Instead, I made myself a bowl of oatmeal with fresh blueberries. And as I sat at my kitchen table, I felt a sense of calm and control that had been missing from my life for far too long. I still had my pills to take, my aches and pains, my moments of loneliness. But I also had a newfound sense of agency, a renewed zest for life. The silence in the house was still there, but it no longer felt so oppressive. It was just quiet, and in that quiet there was room for new sounds, new experiences, new possibilities. Later that day, I went for a walk. I saw Margaret in her garden, and we chatted for a while. She told me she was enjoying her daily watermelon. We made a plan to get coffee later in the week. The hum of the refrigerator was still my companion in the quiet hours, but now it sounded less like a lament and more like a gentle, steady hum of a life in progress. And I, Harold, the retired accountant, the widower, the man of sensible routines, was ready for whatever came next. And it all started with a watermelon. You might think this is the end of the story, but what happened next? Well, that's a whole new chapter.